Hey guys, we're back up in the Power Rankings for Big Brother 26 towards the end of week 3, and this is shaping it to be a very interesting week where even though the start of it was kind of lackluster, I feel like it has really picked up in recent days to where we have some pretty crazy stuff happening, and obviously we'll be talking about all that. Now I am recording this on Tuesday, August 6th. And if you are new to the channel, or if you only follow the show through the TV show, I'll be heavily discussing things that have happened on the live feeds and spoiling the veto results. So if you don't want to be spoiled and want to wait for the TV show, feel free to click out the video now. But with all that out of the way, there are 15 people to talk about, and let's waste no more time. Let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 15, we have the latest boot from the season, and here we have Lisa. And this was largely to be expected here, where she was pretty blatantly the target by the end of it, and she was pretty clear on the bottom for most of the season. And I feel like Lisa largely panned out the way that I expected her to, where she was a pretty bad player, someone who was pretty overconfident about her abilities, someone who didn't really understand what was going on, and she had some pretty poor play at points, like her lying about voting out Matt when she didn't. You also have her telling Angela to her face that she can't associate with her inside or outside of the game. You have people constantly suspecting her of having a power and acting in a way that made it seem like she did have a power, and despite all that, she is still blindsided when she's taken out. So again, I feel like Lisa's a pretty bad player and played a pretty bad game on this season, which is why she's here at number 15. And with that, there are 14 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based off their current game position. Though number 14, we have someone who's not guaranteed to go home, though obviously a lot of that will depend on the AI Arena comp. But number 14, we do have Kenny, and Kenny sucks. And while that's been pretty apparent from week 1, I feel like this week just further exemplifies it. We're coming into the week, he just gives up once again, where he told people that if he didn't win HOH, that he would just be fine going up and potentially going home. And it's just been really frustrating seeing how Kenny's playing this game, where on one hand, he's wanting to give up on multiple opportunities, volunteering for the block, telling people that he doesn't really want to be here, while also being completely unwilling to throw competitions, where even this week he came pretty close to winning the HOH, and he still wants to play in these competitions, which makes me think that that's the only reason he wants to be here, to play in the competitions, and who cares about social strategy? So obviously Kenny's been pretty frustrating to watch and hasn't really brought too much to the actual feeds here. And this is all despite the fact that Cedric winning HOH is one of his best case scenarios, where Cedric is someone who wants to work with him, where we saw them trying to put together this alliance of the Ball Boys. Yet despite that, Kenny still volunteers for the block and is in a spot to where he could go home here, with a lot of this stemming from him being pretty gung-ho and targeting the Women's Alliance, which has caused the likes of Brooklyn and Chelsea to want to target him moving forward. And even with Tucker blowing up his game and someone that the votes could steer on, I feel like there are still enough people willing to let Kenny go to where I could see a world where Kenny goes home regardless. And even if he survives this week, I feel like he's just going to be more the same at this point. I feel like there isn't really that much upside with Kenny's game. And while he could end up getting further into the game, I just have no faith in him to actually garner respect from people in the game, which leaves him here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have the other person on the block right now, and here we have Tucker. And Tucker had such a wild week here, where similar to Kenny, he should have been in a good spot going into this week, where Cedric winning HOH is pretty good, he had people willing to work with him, yet despite that, he once again volunteers for the block, which feels pretty unnecessary in my eyes. And considering that he had just won the AI Arena comp the past week, him potentially winning 2 comps in a row is just completely unnecessary in my eyes. But despite this, he volunteers for the block, then proceeds to win the veto again. At that point, we see him like trying to get Cedric to flush McKenzie's America's veto, which is something that Cedric was very unwilling to do, but then he goes one step further in not even using the veto on himself, and instead using it on Angela of all people. And this was all under the guise of Tucker thinking that Cedric was going to backdoor Quinn, which to be fair, Cedric was on board with at a point, though once Cedric backs out of it and even warns Tucker that this plan is not going to go accordingly, Tucker just refuses to listen for whatever reason, and then things just go completely south at the veto ceremony, where through Tucker using the veto on Angela and then Cedric putting on McKenzie as a replacement nom, it just completely spooks McKenzie into flushing her power, and then Tucker just completely blows up here, where he ends up exposing all Quinn's secrets to the house in an effort to try to blow Quinn's spot, which is something he was intending to do had the Quinn backdoor gone through, where he was going to use the 2 minutes of campaigning after the AI Arena comp to reveal all this stuff in an effort to flip the vote on Quinn at the last moment, which by itself is pretty misguided and probably would have resulted in Tucker being voted out anyway. But if we are looking at what happens here with him exposing this at the veto ceremony, I just feel like it completely blows up Tucker's spot, where moving forward, he completely turns against Cedric, feeling that Cedric betrayed him, even though Cedric had warned him that he wasn't going to backdoor Quinn in this spot. Not to mention that he's still on the block, despite having won the veto and showing his competition ability further. And on top of that, you have people like Joseph wanting to turn on him, where Joseph is someone that wanted to work with Tucker and use him as like his mat figure. But now with Tucker going off, it caused Joseph to drop him. So I feel like Tucker just really blows up his game here for no reason, where he volunteers for the block, he wins the veto only to not use it on himself, and comes off as this loose cannon that makes people not want to keep him around. And he's still on the block now, and someone who probably could go home on eviction night depending on who's there with him. And I feel like for all this, Tucker doesn't really get much in return, where even if he wins the AI Arena comp, he very likely loses Kenny here, one of the only people that was willing to work with him. And then otherwise, he could potentially be sent out the door himself, all for no reason. So again, I feel like all this is pretty bad. And really the only reason he's not at the very bottom is I feel like I have more faith in him to win the AI Arena comp compared to Kenny. And I feel like even if he survives this week, I feel like there is a sliver of a chance that he could recover, even though I feel like he's kind of doomed himself already. So for those reasons, I do have him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who was on the block, but then was taken off, but we do have Angela. And Angela's kind of in a similar spot to where she was before, where coming into the week, she was seen as this easy person to put up on the block, someone who potentially could have been targeted depending on how the veto had gone. And even moving forward, I feel like she's still in a pretty bad spot. No one really takes her seriously. She doesn't really have anyone in the game. And I feel like there are people who probably would have targeted her had she stayed on the block, but at the end of the day, she's not on the block. She is probably safe for the week at this point. So I feel like those things were just enough to not have her at the very bottom, considering she's not in immediate danger. But to be fair, I feel like she'll probably be put up again next week, considering she is this perpetual pawn at this point, and is someone like a Quinn would be pretty apt to target, which considering that Quinn has a defig HOH that he's pretty likely to use if he survives this week, then I feel like that puts Angela in a pretty bad spot coming into next week. And even if it's not that, then she's just someone who's just continuing to skate by in the game, someone who doesn't really have much respect in the game, and I feel like not really much has improved for her compared to last week. Where even with her being saved by Tucker, I feel like that has nothing to do with what Angela actually did. It was more so just Tucker overplaying and thinking that Quinn was going to be backdoored, and Tucker just thinking that he can just win all these comps in order to guarantee the outcome that he wants. So again, not really much I can credit Angela here, which is why she's here number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have another person who's in a pretty rough spot at this point, but we do have McKenzie. And I feel like this week was a net negative for McKenzie, largely because she was forced to use her America's Veto here, where Cedric put her up after the veto meeting, causing her to flush the advantage, which already is pretty bad, but I think what makes it worse is that she knew that she was going to be put up by Cedric and was even fine not using the advantage, where she was fine just sitting on the block on eviction night, and the only reason she ended up using it was due to the way that Tucker used the veto here, where he used it on Angela as opposed to himself, which spooked her out enough where she was unsure about the plan that caused her to use it, where otherwise she probably would have just sat on the block and not used the advantage, which is all pretty bad. And I feel like on top of that, she hasn't really done much to improve her position, where at this point she's being played by the likes of Brooklyn and Chelsea into thinking that they have this women's alliance going, when in reality they have plenty of other options in the game. And I feel like now that McKenzie doesn't have this power anymore, it just makes her an easy person to put up potentially next week and in the weeks afterward. And with her not having any true allies in the game, I could see a world where she's just an easy target to take out one of these weeks, where I feel like there isn't really anyone that's going to fight that hard to keep her around. So I feel like with McKenzie not having this power anymore, the fact that she was willing to not use it, despite her being someone being talked about as a nom, and with her ultimately flushing the advantage, giving away the implicit immunity that she had, I feel like McKenzie's in a pretty rough spot at this point, which is why she's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have another person who's in a pretty rough spot at this point, but we do have Leah. And I feel like this is now the second week in a row where Leah gets kind of lucky here that she isn't put up, where this week we had Cedric seriously considering her as a potential target due to him seeing her as someone that's against him, and gets lucked out by Tucker volunteering for the block once again, which is something she had nothing to do with. But even beyond that, I don't think she plays particularly well either, where you have her whole situation with Cam, where Cam had informed her that she was in danger this week, only for her to turn around and leak a lot of the information that he had shared to other people, which causes Cam to be mad at her. And while they do smooth that over enough by the end of the week, I feel like Leah is someone who's still not really being included in many alliances. And kind of similar to McKenzie, she's just seen as an easy person to put up, where Quinn is talking about how she's one of the easy people to put up next week if he gets a deepfake HOH. So I feel like Leah is someone who is just kind of dangling in the game, doesn't really have many options, and kind of similar to McKenzie, I could easily see her being taken out in a spot where the HOH doesn't want to make a big move and wants there to be an easy week. So I feel like Leah is kind of in a rough spot because of that, which is why she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we actually have someone who I did consider putting a bit higher, though by the end of it, they ended up being slightly lower than they were last week, but we do have Rina. And Rina is someone who I actually thought I had too low last week. I feel like she should have been a little bit higher considering she was being pulled into the Visionaries. And it did seem at a point that she was going to be part of this good group moving forward. Though I feel like considering everything that's happened this week, I feel like this placement is pretty justified here, where the Visionaries do not solidify due to the Cedric HOH result. It's something that kind of gets exposed by a lot of the house. And it, despite Rina not being the central figure within that, being clearly the fourth in that, she ends up taking a lot of the blame for the Visionaries coming together, which kind of makes her a target in the eyes of Cedric, where Cedric very much considered targeting her this week, and again gets lucky by other things happening outside of her control. But then moving forward, you have Tucker blowing up a spot, and Rina once again getting a lot of heat for what Tucker's been doing in the game due to the fact that Rina and Tucker are pretty close. Which again, all this puts Rina in a pretty bad spot. And I feel like despite her not being the most well positioned, and despite her not being the most active player in the world, she's still being talked about as a target where, again, Cedric wanted to target her this week. You have people like Joseph talking about wanting to target her relatively soon. And you have people just blaming her for a lot of things that she didn't directly do. And I feel like with this whole Tucker situation, it'll only just drag her down in the coming days, which is why I'm leaving her here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who I'm kind of conflicted on. I'm not really sure if this was a good week or a bad week for them, though I feel like there's definitely some potential there, but we do have Joseph. And Joseph's kind of in a weird spot where, on one hand, I feel like this is kind of a bad week for him. Where early on, he was considered a potential option for the block. You also have him being forced to let go of Tucker due to Tucker becoming too much for him to handle, kind of similar to how he had to let go of Matt early on in the game. And you also have him still kind of being too loyal to the collective, where you have him trying to put together this meeting of the collective where he feels like he's hammering things in when really everyone else doesn't feel that loyal to it. So again, there's things you can nitpick here, and even now, I know there are some people online saying he's a potential option to go up through America's veto, though I'll have to see what happens there. So again, there's some not great things happening with Joseph, but I feel like there's definitely more good that's happening now with Joseph compared to previous weeks. Where for one, I feel like he does good enough work with Cedric to avoid the block, where he makes a final 2 with Cedric. He has some good game talks there, so I feel like that's some good work on Joseph's end. He also finds out about the Pentagon through Quinn, which makes him recognize that there are definitely other things going on in the game, which could give him some leg room. And I feel like with the game opening up a bit more, that does present Joseph with some opportunities to squeeze his way in. And I feel like if Joseph gets an HOH in the next couple of weeks, I feel like that could definitely benefit his game moving forward. So I feel like Joseph is someone who is definitely starting to have some options, definitely more options than what he had before. It's just a question of whether he can truly capitalize on them or not. So I feel like there's definitely some good and some bad with Joseph's game, which leaves him here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the person who I had at number 1 last week, but we do have Quinn. And I did say last week that despite Quinn seeming to be in the best spot in the house, that there's a lot of potential for it to blow up. And in some ways it did, where ultimately, I feel like he plays this week very sloppily, where you have Cedric winning HOH, someone he had a follow 2 with, and this could have been a great chance for him to shore up that relationship. But instead, he decides for whatever reason to not tell Cedric about his power, despite him having already told other people about his power, which has opened things up for other people to leak his power to Cedric. And sure enough, Cedric does find out about this, and Cedric is genuinely hurt by this. He feels like Quinn is someone who doesn't have his best interests at heart, and we have Cedric coming pretty close to backdooring Quinn by the end of the week, where at one point he was set on the plan happening, and it wasn't until later on that he was talked out of it. And despite this, Quinn had no idea that it was coming, and a lot of it did stem from his own sloppy play with how he handled the information, where it very much felt like Quinn was kind of taking this half measure here, where he wanted to tell some people about his power, and on top of that, what he wanted to do with the power, but then not tell other people, where I feel like he should have either gone all in and told everyone and be public about it, or he should have told no one and just completely blindside everyone. So I feel like this half measure just really opened things up for Quinn's game to crumble, and in some ways it does, where you have him almost being backdoored, and even after he isn't, you have Tucker blowing up his whole spot in front of the house, revealing his power at the veto meeting, which causes Quinn to have to do damage control. And to be fair, I think Quinn does effective work at damage control, but he still has a number of people now against him. You have Leah McKenzie against him now, where I feel like Leah in particular is someone he had wanted to work with, but then Leah just turns against him due to him not maintaining that relationship. And it's made even worse once Cam and Leah realize that he was the one that was trying to drive a wedge between Cam and Leah to begin with, which causes him to be seen as a less trustworthy player. And I think another thing to mention is he's probably not even safe for the week, where there's a chance that he goes up through America's Veto, where he has been getting a bigger presence on the show. And I feel like depending on how the Wednesday night episode is portrayed, there's a very good chance that he could be voted to be on the block on Thursday night. And if he's there against Tucker, I feel like that could be a pretty close vote depending on how things shape up, where I feel like there are definitely people that would be willing to vote out Quinn in that spot. So I do feel like Quinn's position has definitely worsened compared to last week. I feel like this week has really shown his flaws coming back to bite him a little bit. And while I feel like if he survives this week, he'll probably be in an okay position, and with him planning to use the power next week, that could buy him some time, I do feel like Quinn will eventually become this massive target in the house, where you even have people wanting to target him at this point. And I feel like that will just continue to get worse for him moving forward, which is why he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who is in a similar spot compared to last week, but we do have Cam. And I feel like Cam was definitely not as active compared to last week, though I feel like there are still some things to mention here, where he is technically the one to tell Cedric about Quinn's power, where obviously Quinn had not told Cedric about it, so I feel like that's something. You also have Leah leaking a lot of the information that he spilled due to their conversation, which did cause a rift between them, though they later turned it around to a degree. And I feel like Cam's, for the most part, in a similar spot where, yes, he is part of this new Balls Boys alliance, though obviously with 2 of those members on the block, I do feel like that's probably going to be pretty short-lived. So I feel like Cam's kind of in a similar spot compared to last week, and with him not being severely damaged, especially not compared to where he was last week, I do have him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we actually have the current head of household, but we do have Cedric. And Cedric's HOH reign is pretty crazy for the most part, where all he wanted was an easy week, but ended up getting way more than he bargained for, where essentially he wanted to have an easy week, kind of similar to Chelsea, where he wanted people to volunteer for the block, which has been a pretty crazy trend on this season. And sure enough, he does get it, where you had the likes of Angela, Kenny, and Tucker offering themselves up, despite him considering other options, where we did see him early in the week want to target the likes of Leah or Rubina, where I feel like Rubina in particular would have been the ideal target for Cedric, as it would have nipped the visionary thing in the bud right away, but he eventually steers away from that plan. And while he's later able to build a new alliance in the Ball Boys, I feel like that ends up being pretty short-lived, where you have the likes of Tucker wanting him to do things that he doesn't even want to do, like flushing McKenzie's power and backdooring Quinn. And we see Cedric being pretty receptive to a lot of these things, where obviously he does put up McKenzie after the veto is used, and he is initially on board with the Quinn plan, though later backs out of that. Though I feel like a key problem for Cedric here is he's just way too passive across this week, where I feel like having both Kenny and Tucker on the block is pretty bad to begin with, as you're really opening things up for one of them to go home here. You have Tucker not using the veto on himself, which obviously leads him up to be taken out. You have Tucker getting mad at Cedric for not backdooring Quinn and being against him, though to be fair, I feel like Cedric plays that pretty well, where a lot of the house is on Cedric's side over Tucker's. And you have him flushing McKenzie's power, which I feel like is pretty unnecessary, as it just gives McKenzie a reason to target him in the future. And while McKenzie definitely has other options, and you have people talking about how they have Cedric's back, I feel like Cedric could have gotten away with not doing that, And I feel like had he been more proactive this week and not been so willing to just let other people do the work for him, I feel like he could have made this an optimal week for him, where he could have been more decisive in targeting the likes of Leah or Rina, while at the same time building a power structure that could better his position moving forward. But instead, through his passiveness, it results in him having these things happen that he doesn't really want to happen. And while he's not a target by anyone, at least not in the foreseeable future, I feel like he definitely could have played this HOH a lot better. And I feel like as it is, he's not really getting an ideal outcome for him, either from a target standpoint or from a position standpoint. Now, at the end of the day, he's still in a fine enough position. I feel like he still has plenty of people by his side, even with everything that's gone on. But I feel like he didn't really do more to further build upon his game. And I feel like he was just a bit too passive, which is why he's here number 5. Now moving on to number 4. And I did consider these next two as you could definitely debate them being number 1 and 2. However, after thinking about it and considering where we are in the game, I did decide to go with Brooklyn here at number 4. And the thing about Brooklyn is she definitely has a lot of opportunities right now. And I would say that the whole Tucker situation is a net positive for her in the sense that it takes some heat off of her. It allows a lot of her alliances to remain hidden. And I think there's definitely some potential there with Brooklyn. However, at the same time, I still worry about her long term, where there are definitely people talking about targeting her at some point. You have people like Joseph, who wants her to make jury, but not too much further beyond that. You have people like Kenny that want to target her not too long from now. I think there are definitely people that are starting to see Brooklyn's game more and more. And while I think she should be safe in the short term, I do think that she'll continue to be on people's minds moving forward. And I think that could definitely lead to her being targeted. So I think that's a big reason why I can't have her too highly. And while I think the Tucker situation benefits her, I think a lot of that is contingent upon her being able to actually enact upon that. And while there's definitely some promise there, I feel like until I actually see it, I can't really feel too confident saying that she's in a solid position right now. So while I think she's definitely good in the short term, and I feel like the whole Tucker situation benefits her, I feel like with the fact that she hasn't been more active in the game, and I feel like with her still needing to do things in order to propel herself into a better position, I do have to leave her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone who's in a somewhat similar position, but we do have Chelsea. And I think Chelsea is kind of in a similar spot to Brooklyn, where both of them have this opportunity now with the whole Tucker situation to solidify their alliances. They obviously have the Women's Alliance, they have the Pentagon, like they have all these various options that they could be to working towards. And I feel like now with Tucker blowing up his game, I can see the Visionaries pulling in the likes of Brooklyn or Chelsea. I do feel like as a whole, both Brooklyn and Chelsea are in a pretty interesting spot right now where they have these opportunities before them. And I feel like if they're able to capitalize upon them, then they could definitely benefit their games in the future. It's just a question of whether they'll actually be able to do it, and whether a lot of that will carry over into the next HOH, which will likely be Quinn's HOH. And I feel like there's definitely some confidence there, though I feel like until I actually see it, I can't really have the likes of Brooklyn or Chelsea at the very top of the list. Though I think they're still in pretty interesting spots at the moment. And I feel like with Chelsea being the less targeted of the duo of her and Brooklyn, I do have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this top 2 may be a bit controversial, especially considering the day's events. However, I still feel like considering the fact that Quinn is about to be the next HOH, I do feel like they have room to recover. But number 2, I did decide to go with T-Core, and I do think compared to last week, I think they're definitely more exposed now than they were before, where you had last week the whole Visionaries as a potential option, only for them to not win HOH and for people to kind of pick up on the Visionaries being this alliance, which obviously is not particularly great for the likes of Kemo and T-Core. And when you mix in all the Quinn and Tucker stuff, where Quinn is now more exposed and Kemo and Tucker are seen more, I do think that kind of harms her position to a degree, and you could definitely argue that Brooklyn and Chelsea should be higher than them. Or I feel like if we are just looking at their position in the game right now, I would say Brooklyn and Chelsea have more potential to overtake the top 2 spots right now. But I feel like the main reason I'm going with these top 2 is I feel like with Quinn seeming to be the next HOH, I think that definitely gives them a chance to correct those mistakes from last week. Where now that Quinn no longer has to worry about the power due to it being out there, I think that gives them the opportunity to solidify the Visionaries. I feel like with Brooklyn and Chelsea as potential options to be pulled in, I think there's still potential for the Visionaries to really come together and be a more powerful force in the game, especially considering that we still don't really have a solidified power structure in the house. I feel like there's still that vacuum that the Visionaries could take up, particularly when you factor in the fact that Quinn is very likely to be the next HOH. And I feel like through that, that benefits T-Core a lot. I feel like T-Core is someone who would benefit a lot from that. I feel like T-Core is someone who is still not being targeted much in the house despite all the things that have been going on. Where instead the likes of Quinn and Rina have been bigger targets compared to T-Core. And I think T-Core still has a lot of longevity within her, though obviously this week was probably net negative for them, but it may not even matter in the future depending on how the next HOH ring goes. And that's the reason that I had to go with T-Core here at number 2. And now at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Big Brother 26 right now is Kemo. And obviously there's a debate for Kemo being lower here, where he was technically exposed this week, where Tucker exposed to the house that Kemo had known about Quinn's power, but didn't really tell anyone about it, which in theory should have exposed Kemo as being closely linked to Quinn and someone that could be potentially targeted because of that. But instead, we haven't really seen anyone talking about targeting Kemo, where despite all this being a net negative, I feel like Kemo still comes out of it relatively safe. And I feel like there are definitely bigger priorities compared to the likes of Kemo at this point, even outside the easy targets in Angela, Kenny, Leah, and McKenzie, or even Tucker, the person who seemingly is the most upset about not getting his way here, is more upset at Cedric of all people. And I feel like no one's really focusing much on Kemo at this point, where obviously all the eyes are on the likes of Quinn and Tucker at this point, and even Rina had a bigger target on her compared to last week. So I feel like Kemo is still in a pretty good spot despite this being a net negative for his game. And I feel like similar to what I said about T-Core, I feel like Quinn being the next HOH could be an opportunity to rectify the downslide that has happened from this week. So I feel like mixing that in with the way everyone else in the house stands right now, I feel like it's definitely going to be interesting seeing whether it'll be the Kemo and T-Core group that come on top, or if Brooklyn and Chelsea will truly capitalize on the opportunities before them. Where truth be told, there is an argument for Brooklyn and Chelsea being number 1, considering that they technically have more opportunities at the moment. But I just feel like considering that Quinn is pretty likely to be the next HOH and has the opportunity to really solidify the Visionaries, I did decide to go with Kemo here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really help with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.